The title that Jesus most often used for himself, as you read through the Gospels, it becomes really apparent that his favorite phrase is to refer to himself as the Son of Man. Now we know everything Jesus did, every word that he spoke, it was so calculated. It was designed to provide meaning to the individuals who were listening to those words 2,000 years ago, and designed to provide meaning to us today, 2,000 years later. And so why would he continuously refer to himself throughout his entire 3.5-year ministry? What was this meaning? What was the message? And again, if you just read through the 4 Gospels, you see Jesus saying, birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head. You will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds. You will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Father. And on it goes dozens and dozens of times. I think the most straightforward reason, the simplest reason, the first thing we probably should put on the table is Christ did come in the flesh. And though he was fully God, the Bible speaks about Christ being the exact imprint of God's nature, that he was with God in the beginning. Though he was fully divine, Christ also became fully human. Theologians talk about the divine becoming incarnate. God took on flesh. And so in one sense, Jesus referring to himself as the Son of Man may have just been a way to say, to reinforce, I am a human. I am the son of a man. I am the son of another person. I am a biological human being just as you all are. And the Bible also tells us, specifically I think about Paul's writings in Romans chapter 5. If you want to narrow it down, look at Romans 5 verses 12 to 21. And it speaks about that Adam was this representative. As the first human, Adam was this representative for the entire human race. In fact, that word Adam, that Hebrew word Adam, just basically means a man or a human, a person. And Adam was this representative human. So when Adam sinned, there were ultimately consequences for all of us. The curse affects now all of us because our representative human sin. But those same verses in Romans 5, 12 to 21 speaks about Jesus also being the final overall human representative. And it says the things that Christ did on the cross and in rising from the grave also have profound benefits for all humans as well. So perhaps in a very real sense, Jesus is saying, I'm not just a son of man, but I'm the Son of Man. I am the second, but also the more important and also the final representative for mankind, for humans. But the third, and maybe the main answer actually, a third answer, and perhaps the main, it goes back to a vision that the prophet Daniel had, and you read about this in the book, the Old Testament book of Daniel, in Daniel chapter 7. A vision, a prophecy that Daniel had around 600 years or so before Jesus was born. And if you're familiar with the book of Daniel, you know it has literally some of the most amazing and important prophecies in all of Scripture. Daniel is just this astounding, eye-opening book. And every time you read it, even if you've read it before, you just stand in awe of what was written. You stand in awe of God and how Daniel just lays out the future. For example, in Daniel chapter 9, he gives the time frame for when the Messiah would come to earth, when the Messiah's ministry would begin, the fact that the Messiah would be cut off 3.5 years into his ministry. He speaks about the temple being destroyed, which the Romans destroyed in AD 66 to 70. All of these things, after Daniel speaks about the Babylonian Empire would be taken over by the Persian Empire, and then the Persian Empire by the Greek, and the Greek Empire by the Roman, and the Romans would be the empire in place when the Messiah came. The Messiah would be cut off in 3.5 years. The temple would be destroyed. in another 3.5 year time frame. So Daniel 9 alone is one of the most amazing chapters in all of the Bible. But in Daniel chapter 7, we're just going to focus on verses 9 to 14. Let me read Daniel chapter 7, 9 to 14, because here we get this phrase, one like a son of man. And I think it's very clear Jesus was pointing his listeners back to Daniel chapter 7 when he said this. Daniel chapter 7, verse 9 to 14. Daniel says, "As I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames. Its wheels were burning fire. A stream of fire issued and came out from before him. 1,000 thousands served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. I looked then because of the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking. And as I looked, the beast was killed, and its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed." And so immediately as we read Daniel's vision, we know the Ancient of Days is clearly referring to the eternal God of heaven, the one in Genesis who in the beginning created all things, the one who in Genesis said to Abraham, "I will make of you a great nation," the one in Exodus who gave Moses the 10 Commandments, etc. So this Ancient of Days is this eternal God of heaven. It's the eternal God of the Bible. We get this beautiful Old Testament imagery. His clothing being white as snow just represents that God is perfectly holy. God is perfectly righteous. Jesus, when he was teaching his disciples how to pray in Matthew 6, he said, "Pray then this way, our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Holy, sanctified, set apart be your name," he was saying. And so his clothing was white as snow represents God being hallowed, holy, righteous. The idea of the hair being pure white or being pure white as wool is a reference to God's wisdom. God is truth, and God has all wisdom. And of course, all the flame and fire imagery is talking about that God has both the authority and the ability to judge his creation. And so we see that the eternal God is set on the throne in all of his holiness and righteousness. His wisdom, as always, is on display. He's prepared to begin judging his enemies while millions and millions serve him and tens of millions are gathered around him. And then Daniel says, "with the clouds of heaven." That's an intriguing phrase because the Ancient of Days is already seated. It says the thrones were placed and the Ancient of Days took his seat. So the Ancient of Days is already seated. Coming with the clouds is the domain of God. It's the privilege of God. It belongs exclusively to God. So for example, look at Isaiah chapter 19 and you'll get this idea. You'll understand this idea that being in the clouds, coming with the clouds, that's the domain of God. That's prerogative of God. That's the privilege of God alone. So this, with the clouds of heaven there came, you expect that sentence to end. With the clouds of heaven there came a divine being, because that is only the position and the place of a divine being. Rather, Daniel says, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man. You can almost hear Daniel as he's rewriting as he's writing this vision down, he's reliving this confusion. How can something of a divine nature coming on the clouds of heaven to the Ancient of Days be like a son of a man? And so while it may not have been completely obvious when Daniel wrote this in Daniel 7, and when folks read this for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years before Christ showed up, what looks very obvious looking back is Daniel was saying, yes, this was an entity of a divine nature. Otherwise, they couldn't have been coming with the clouds. And it also was an entity that was incarnate, that was human, that also had a human nature, just like a son of man. And so it appears to me that Christ, by saying the Son of Man, you will see the Son of Man do this, the Son of Man has no place to lay his head, I believe Jesus was simply saying, think back to Daniel. And this king was coming because to this one who was like a son of man, a kingdom was given. And so the Jews, of course, had been expecting a king. They used the word Messiah. The Greeks would use the word Christ. In English, we would simply say an anointed king. And so the Jews were expecting a Messiah, a Christ, an anointed king who would be given domain and glory for an everlasting kingdom where everyone, peoples from every nation and language, would serve him. By saying the Son of Man, Jesus was saying, I am divine, I am human, I am the expected Christ, the Messiah, I am the anointed King, to whom all dominion will be revealed at the end of time. And I think one of the reasons he may have used language such as that is because the Romans, who if Jesus had come out and boldly said, I am a king, I am the anointed king that the Jews are expecting, Rome would have much more quickly tried to eliminate him as a threat. And so early on, as people figured out, Jesus would sometimes say to them, don't tell anybody who you figured out I am. I need to work my mission, establish my disciples and apostles before I get completely sideways of Rome. When the time was right, Jesus says to things like the Sanhedrin that was trying him in his last hours before he was crucified. He said things like, you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Father. And they realized, oh, he is claiming to be the divine figure from Daniel 7 who ultimately receives all the kingdoms from God. He is claiming to be God. And so once it became obvious to those who understood the Daniel 7 reference, then they told Rome, this man is a threat. But early on, to refer to yourself as the Son of Man, it certainly was saying, I'm human. It certainly was saying, I'm a representative human in the manner of Adam, but even a more powerful one. And he was certainly drawing a reference back to Daniel 7 as being the one who came with the clouds of heaven, who was like a son of man, to whom dominion and glory would be given forever. But it just allowed him to do it, as did many of his parables. It allowed him to teach pretty obvious teachings in a way that fed those who he was seeking to feed, but didn't necessarily alert or agitate prematurely those who would ultimately work against him. Jesus Christ is the Son of Man. From the gospel, Jesus Christ is one like a son of man from Daniel chapter 7. He is also the promised Messiah. He is the risen Lord and Savior. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, this is Andy.